Welcome back to the deep dive. So if you're expecting a standard breakdown of foreign policy or domestic politics today, we're going to reorient your expectations just a little bit.
Yeah, we're not really looking at a typical political story here.
No, we're going beneath the headlines. We're looking at the psychology, you could almost call it the architecture, of what happens when fear and identity become, well, stronger than the rule of law.
That's absolutely right. Our sources today, they do center on a specific event, Donald Trump's actions regarding Venezuela and the GOP reaction that followed.
Right.
But they treat it less like a news story and more like a diagnostic test. The whole thing is framed as this quiet decay.
Not loud or sudden?
Exactly. It's relentless. The sources use this fantastic metaphor. It's very visceral. They say it's like a house whose foundation has been eaten away by insects. So from the street, the structure looks totally fine, but underneath, the collapse is already guaranteed because the supports are just gone.
And our mission for you today is pretty simple. We want to cut through the noise about policy and really extract the core insight here. This story is, at its heart, about how human beings, and not just people in power, really anyone under pressure, surrender their judgment when fear, identity, and power all collide.
It's about psychological surrender itself.
Yes, exactly.
And to really understand that, you need a framework. So we're drawing on some key psychological concepts today, particularly from Robert Greene's The Laws of Human Nature. He argues that the greatest danger to any society isn't necessarily some external evil, some grand villain.
It's more subtle.
It's ordinary people who stop thinking. They just dissolve their individual will, their own moral compass, into the will of a leader.
That's chilling, because you're saying the political failure isn't structural, it's personal.
It is, and that psychological transfer is the exact mechanism by which, as our sources point out, cruelty begins to feel like duty.
And the unthinkable just becomes
merely what had to be done. It's all about the erosion of those internal boundaries that are supposed to keep power in check.
Okay, let's unpack that erosion. We have to start with the political event that triggered all this psychological fallout.
The transgression.
The transgression, as the source material calls it. Donald Trump launches what it describes as an unlawful invasion of Venezuela. But what makes it so potent psychologically is how it happens. It's fast. It's forceful.
And it completely bypasses that slow, public, often frustrating democratic process.
A process designed specifically to restrain that human hunger for domination.
And that speed, the decisiveness, that's key. It forces an immediate reaction from Congress. And that's where the real story begins, with the response of the Meiji Republicans.
They didn't pause.
Not at all. They didn't step back to question the authority or warn about consequences, and they certainly didn't protect the Constitution's demand that Congress authorize war.
They just rushed forward to do one thing.
Justify.
Justify.
Precisely. They become the crucial figures who make the disaster normal. And our sources give us this perfect, immediate case study, Maggie A. Mike Johnson.
And he's described as a courtier soul. We have to stop on that phrase because it's so loaded. What does that even mean in practical terms?
Well, think of a courtier soul as the ultimate yes man, or maybe more like the ultimate servant. Their identity isn't shaped by principles like the Constitution, but entirely by their proximity to the ruler.
Their survival depends on the king's approval, not the country's law.
Exactly. So when Johnson addressed Congress, his goal wasn't to defend the Constitution. It was to shrink this vast reality of war into a tiny technicality that just fit the need for obedience.
And he did that by saying that the centuries-old constitutional rule that Congress has to authorize war before it happens was basically reduced to just a requirement for notification afterward.
It's an astonishing contraction of law. And here's where the psychology gets really interesting, because this isn't just a convenient political argument.
No, it's a psychological necessity.
It is. This connects directly to Greene's idea that when people attach their core identity to a powerful figure like Donald Trump, their mind literally has to reorganize reality to sustain that attachment.
So the law isn't the priority anymore. The preservation of the self is.
That's it. Facts become flexible, contradictions get erased. To challenge Donald Trump, for Johnson to say he committed an unlawful act of war would feel like self-annihilation.
Wow.
He is required on a deep defensive level to defend the version of himself that only exists if Donald Trump is never wrong. That defense is rooted in fear, not legal principle. He's speaking from the raw anxiety of dependency.
And that dependency, it quickly morphs into performance, which brings us to our second phase, emotional outsourcing.
Right.
The sources note the invasion didn't produce the political alarm you'd expect. Instead, it produced this choreographed display. Performance, smiles, and praises.
It was an immediate effort at moral camouflage. The language they used was deliberately self-deceptive.
They called conquest security.
Right. And they called the potential theft of resources stability. They're trying to invent a moral language to disguise this raw imperial desire.
And the contradictions were immediate and just, glaring. They claimed it was not regime change, even as Donald Trump was removing one leader and installing another from that same authoritarian structure.
It's an instant attempt to confuse the narrative. They want the benefits of control, the oil, the regional dominance, without the moral burden of claiming ownership of it.
So in one breath, they deny control, but in the next.
In the next, they're openly talking about seizing Venezuela's oil, persuading its leadership, and shaping its future. If you strip away the diplomatic talk, the sources are clear. This is simply leverage.
Which is defined plainly as the language of empire.
It is.
And this shift into empire speak brings us right into the core of cultic thinking. And the ultimate example here has to be Jim Jordan.
Oh, absolutely.
His response when he was asked directly about American boots on the ground in Venezuela. He didn't offer a legal precedent. He didn't offer a policy justification.
No, nothing like that. He offered emotional outsourcing. His entire argument was, and this is a profound quote, just trust Donald Trump. That's it. That's all he offered.
Just trust him. I mean, when you say that to a population, you're asking for a complete and total abdication of their own judgment. You're telling them, don't think.
You are. And this is exactly what Greene identifies as the longing for a parental figure. When societies feel uncertain, when the world seems complex, people psychologically regress.
They want a strong protector.
They crave a strong protector who will relieve them of the difficult moral burden of thinking and judging for themselves. Trust is just so much easier than independent thought.
So the mind prefers that comforting, coherent story, the strong man, the hero, over the uncomfortable, messy truth of constitutional reality.
Absolutely. The mind will surrender freedoms, even the right to question the start of a war, in exchange for the feeling of safety that a strong leader provides. Jim Jordan, in that moment, he was speaking directly to that deep, primal craving for certainty.
And once that moral cost is outsourced, we move into the third phase, the normalization of force.
This is a critical line to cross.
A huge, invisible line. The Magi GOP didn't just accept the invasion, they celebrated it. They called the operation brilliant. Textbook.
It's the moment where congressional oversight just completely collapses.
It becomes pure, uncritical applause.
And this taps into another fundamental human flaw. Our deep attraction to displays of raw force. They're hypnotic. When power is unleashed with speed and, apparent competence, it literally bends judgment. It dulls empathy.
Destruction can look like competence.
Exactly. When it's presented cinematically, it can look decisive.
That explains why the whole discussion around Venezuela became so transactional and cold, doesn't it? They discussed it like a chessboard, logistics, oil, positioning, rather than a country with people and ethics.
Exactly. To resolve that inner conflict of supporting an unlawful action, the mind has to flatten reality. This is where the anesthetic of language comes in.
If you can't admit complicity, you change the words.
You have to. War becomes operations. Seizing resources becomes security. This is psychological self-defense. It lets the politician maintain this comforting fantasy that the action is controlled and benevolent.
But every fantasy eventually cracks. The sources point out that the final mask of benevolence is removed by someone like Stephen Miller.
Right, who doesn't even bother pretending this is about democracy or law.
No pretense at all.
Miller cuts straight to the raw voice of imperial psychology. He speaks of sheer domination, of superpower entitlement, of seizing resources and asserting interests without apology.
He just discards the legal niceties entirely.
Which exposes the core motivation the sources were tracking all along. Venezuela is a place where Donald Trump can demonstrate unrestrained, unchecked will.
And it reveals this is about a psychology of expansion, not security, which is powerfully illustrated when the sources note he spoke of Venezuela and Greenland in almost the same breath.
Both framed as objects for acquisition. They're just assets on a global balance sheet. It proves the point. The objective wasn't stability. It was demonstration. The action was taken to show the world and his base that his will is not bound by international norms or, critically, by Congress.
That demonstration is what makes our final section so important.
Yeah.
Because there is one perspective that just stands out in this whole discussion, the voice of experience.
Jason Crow.
A veteran who has actually confronted the reality of force, and he offers this very sobering counterpoint.
His perspective carries immense weight. He speaks of the ghosts of Iraq and Afghanistan. He warns that military operations always look flawless at first. They're clean, surgical, cinematic.
Like a good movie trailer.
Exactly, but the real catastrophe comes later. It comes in money, in lives, in moral corrosion. Those who have actually faced the reality of war rarely romanticize these displays of power.
And this foreign action, it connects right back home, because the Man GA2 response is a loud lesson plan for the rest of us. They are teaching Americans what their institutions are now.
It creates this devastating internal mirror for American democracy. The source suggests that societies rot from imitation. When flattery and obedience are the only things being rewarded in Congress, moral evasion becomes a cultural habit.
The behavioral classroom of power, operating right in plain sight.
Yes.
And the core danger here, which is so essential for you, the listener, to grasp, is desensitization. Donald Trump floods the space with transgression. He pushes the boundaries so relentlessly that the mind just grows tired of reacting.
Outrage feels futile after a while.
It does. And a fatigued, exhausted population adapts.
And adaptation in this context is the quiet death of boundaries. If you stop reacting to a transgression, you tacitly allow it to become the new normal. And the precedent set by Venezuela is profound.
Let's lay that out really clearly. If Donald Trump can invade Venezuela without authorization and be met with praise, then Congress is no longer necessary for war.
And if he can select Venezuela's leadership and have the GOP applaud it, then elections are no longer structurally necessary for legitimacy.
The entire question shifts.
Dramatically. It moves from what is legal to what is loyal. That is the fundamental psychological shift we've been tracking.
So we've covered the entire architecture of this surrender. Now for the synthesis. What does this entire deep dive mean for the individual citizen, for you listening right now?
I think it's a warning. It's a warning about moral agency. The core surrender happens when a society transfers its moral responsibility to a single figure. When people say, just trust him, they are confessing abdication.
They're saying, I don't want to carry this burden anymore.
Exactly. I no longer wish to carry the burden of judgment. And that burden is heavy. It requires discomfort. It requires social risk. And most people, under sustained pressure, will choose that psychological shelter over moral responsibility.
But the cost of choosing that shelter is steep.
It is, because when accountability vanishes, power doesn't just rest, it begins to experiment. Venezuela is that experiment. It tests the limits of what can be justified. The most frightening aspect is not that Donald Trump ordered an invasion. Leaders have always done that. The frightening thing is how many people were psychologically ready to instantly rationalize it.
So we'll leave you with this final thought, drawn from the source material. History is unambiguous about what follows when restraint becomes optional. The real warning from Venezuela is not that war has begun.
And the real warning is that restraint is ending.